with that plug, I want to introduce our penultimate speaker for the day. Michael Macy is the Goldman Smith Professor at Cornell with appointments in sociology, information science, and also the director of the Social Dynamics Lab at Cornell, and is wrapping up in a few weeks now a year-long stint at the Center for Advanced Study of Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. So, delighted to introduce Michael. Take it away.
Well, thanks, Nash, and thanks for inviting me. Actually, this is my fourth Sonic N meeting.
You're the only person, I believe, besides the organizers, who's been to all four.
So I actually gave talks at three of them. One was on the importance of noise. Another one was on network autocorrelation. And the one today is on critical mass. So critical mass in physics refers to the density of mousetraps at which a ping pong ball can initiate a chain reaction, as you're seeing here. And one interesting thing about this configuration is that is actually a network. It's a lattice of mousetraps. But social scientists have a different perspective on critical mass, particularly in social movement theory. And it's expressed by Gandhi. Critical mass is a small body of determined spirits who are able to change the course of history. Margaret Mead, critical mass is a small group of thoughtful, concerned citizens who are able to change the world. And in social movement theory, it has a somewhat more specific meaning, and probably I think the standard text on this is by Marwell and Oliver and Teixeira, that they say collective action depends on a critical mass that pays the startup costs and induces widespread collective action. And they explain this with a production function for public good. And the critical mass is this point at which the level of contribution reaches a point at which the payoff begins to exceed the cost of contribution so that other people will pay it besides the hardcore group who are able to start the collective action by being willing to invest, to contribute, even when you're in a very flat region of the curve and the slope is very shallow. But a key assumption in that theory is that the network is a complete graph. Everyone's connected to everyone else, or it's a random graph, but it's fully mixed. There's no local structure. And what I'd like to propose today is a network theory of critical mass. And in this theory, the critical mass is the level of mobilization by a core of activists at which social movements can begin to leverage or to take advantage of bridges that span between network clusters. So that's a very specific definition. I think it's a new one, and I'm going to explain the reasoning that underpins that conclusion. And that reasoning goes back to Mark Granovetter, the author of one of, I think it may be the most cited paper in all of the social sciences. Granovetter's theory of the strength of weak ties. These bridges between clusters are relationally weak in the sense that there's low trust, it's an acquaintance, you don't interact very often, but structurally strong because whatever is to be diffused can reach a large number of people and do it faster when it's passed over these weak ties or bridges. And an important focus here is on whatever is to be diffused, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. And this really is accepted, I think, as one of the lawful regularities of social life and social science. And the argument was extended by Watson Strogatz, who were addressing the famous question of the 6 degrees of separation of Stanley Milgram and Kevin Bacon fame. So here's an example of this phenomena. So here's me. Here's my college roommate, Les Schwab, who is a CMO of Harvard Vanguard. He's a physician and one of my oldest and dearest friends, along with Nash and a few other people I've known for most of my life. So Les and I go way back to college. And then this is a friend of Les's, very close friend of Les's. And the interesting thing here is that we were able to figure this out because it's not a connection through Nosh or Peter or someone at USC, but through my college roommate, who's not an academic. So how is this possible? I mean, the planet is really large. We've got 6.5 billion people. And yet the world is small, 6 degrees traditionally. Lars Backstrom at Facebook says it's actually 4.7. And I think Eric Horvitz has a little higher. I forget, what's Eric's number? A little, somewhere in between. We need about 5 more studies on that, don't we, to figure out. But the question is, how is this possible? And it would be sort of explainable if the world were a random network, but it's not. And that really adds to the mystery because the social ties tend to be very clustered and closed. And so, for example, if A is friends with B and C, then there's a very good chance that B is connected to C. So when you have these small circles of friends, how can you span any 2 randomly chosen people on the globe in just 6 moves? And the answer was given by Watts and Strogatz, working at Cornell in the late 90s. And what they showed is that a very small number of weak ties, which is the one you see here, that connect clusters are sufficient to give even a highly clustered network the connectivity of a completely random network. And so you can have both. In a very clustered world, it can also be have very high connectivity and therefore very small average path distance. And this has important implications, obviously, for the spread of information, also disease, that they can spread very, very rapidly and very far. But remember I said whatever is to be diffused. So here we're going to come back to that. Is this true of social contagions? So social contagions differ from information and disease in that with information, if you hear the same sports score from 2 people, it's redundant. But if you hear the same advice from several people, that's often crucial. And that's, I think, the case for many social movements, that hearing about it from one person may not get you to join. But when you hear it from several people, then perhaps you do. And so the question is, can high-threshold social movements that require a high level of social reinforcement from multiple network neighbors and friends, can they spread on a small world network? So to answer this question, Damon Centola and I replicated the Watts and Strogatz original experiment. And then all we did, we just changed one thing. We just raised the threshold from 1, which is what it is for information and disease, to the lowest possible number larger than 1. We raised it to 2, but obviously it could be a lot higher than that. So let's see what happens. So we raise it from 1 to 2, we watch to see what happens. So we start with replicating Watts and Strogatz. And the way you read this is that the x-axis is how much clustering there is. It goes from high to low as the proportion of random ties goes up. And the y-axis is time steps, so fast is actually low. And what you see here is that that's the small world effect. And that was, we nailed it. It's exactly the same number that Watts and Strogatz got. That you get this remarkable speed up between 0 and 0.1 proportion random ties. And when you get to 0.1, you don't need to go anymore. You hit the same speed that you're going to get in a completely random network, but it's still highly clustered. So we replicated their study. Now, so that's boring because it's already been done. Everybody knows about this. But now we're just doing one thing. We're just going to raise the threshold. We're just going to raise it a little tiny bit. Let's go from 1 to 2. So now when we go to 2, the area of improvement is now much smaller. And if you go any further, you lose that. You're right back to where you were. It disappears. And then if we go to 3, threshold of 3, no improvement. But what is probably more important than speed is that in both cases, very early on, you're hitting a phase transition. And the contagion will not spread at all. It just stops in its tracks. So it's not a matter of how fast, but how far. And it doesn't go very far. And it doesn't take much of a threshold increase to get to that point. So, maybe for social movements, maybe it's not such a small world. Where the willingness to do something depends on the number of your friends who are encouraging you, you get a triangle effect, which I'm going to illustrate here. So I and J are activated nodes. K and L are not. So I and J are sufficient to activate, I and J are sufficient to activate K. And then J and K can activate L, because K and L have threshold 2. And so now you'll notice that there's a triangle here. That L is being activated by J and K, who are also neighbors of each other. And so what this is showing is contrary to both Granovetter and to Watson's rovettes. For the spread of high threshold phenomena like social movements, it's not the bridges that are doing the work, it's the triangles, it's the clustering. It depends on local structure, or as Tip O'Neill famously put it, all politics is local. So here's the ideas. A, B, and C are not activated. They have not joined the movement. A has 3 friends in the movement, but they're not friends of each other. A has 1 friend in the movement. A has 1 friend in the movement out of these 3. B is friends with all 3, but they're not friends with each other. And C has 3 friends, but they are all friends with each other. And so the question is, who is more likely to join? And the prediction is that it will be C, because with a high threshold, you need that local structure to get the reinforcement. So we tested this idea, working with Nathan Eagle and Rob Claxton, with the nearly complete phone logs for 4 weeks in the UK, which gave us basically as close as you can get to the full social network of an entire country. So you want to see what the social network of the UK looks like. Here's a picture. And there are the network characteristics for what it's worth. A little bit more than 6 degrees of separation, but that's because we had eliminated the hubs and call centers and whatnot. But the important thing is we wanted to study diffusion on this network, and we had a wonderful experiment that fell into our lap because BT was marketing a voicemail product, and they were doing it virally with no advertising. So the only way you could hear about this was over the BT network. Wow, perfect, right? And so we took a sample of people who had not adopted, but had at least 1 adopter friend. And then we looked to see how does the probability of adoption increase with the number of triangles, or triadic closure. And here are the results. So this is among everybody who has 7 friends who've adopted. So we're not varying that. They've all got the same number of friends who've adopted. But what differs is how many triangles among the friends. And it's almost perfectly linear. The probability of adoption is going up almost linearly with the number of triangles. So why did the triangles matter? Well, one obvious explanation is that triad closure is just a proxy for unmeasured tie strength. So the idea is that maybe the ties are stronger here where it's closed triad, that A has stronger ties to B and C, and hence B and C exert more influence on A. That's a very reasonable explanation and fits with previous research. And so we tested that by netting out tie strength as measured by call volume and frequency of interaction. So we removed that, and we look at the effect net of tie strength. And as you can see, there's almost no change. So it wasn't tie strength, even though we thought it would be, but it turned out it was not. There's something else going on here besides tie strength, and maybe it's the fact that that this virally marketed product, you needed to hear about it more than once, or from more than one person. So to sum up, the idea here is that these bridge ties that connect clusters don't provide sufficient redundancy, which sounds like an oxymoron, right? Necessary redundancy. But actually it turns out that for social movements and social contagions and high threshold diffusion, You need the redundancy because you need the reinforcement from multiple adopting neighbors. But here comes critical mass. Unless the movement reaches critical mass. When it reaches critical mass, the social movement can spread just like information and disease, which means it can leverage the bridge ties, jump across the network, open up new fronts of expansion, and spread really fast as it would on a random network. But you've got to get to that point. And the interesting thing is, it is a point. This isn't linear. It's a phase change. You hit that point and boom, you take off. And the good news for people who like to predict, you can use this for prediction. So, here's some demonstrations. Just for fun, I'm doing this one on a Voronoi diagram just because you're probably sick of looking at lattice networks if you're in this game. So, okay, we'll do it on a Voronoi diagram. This is really for my sociology friends. When I use a regular lattice, they say, but wait a minute, social networks don't have regular degree. Okay, so the degree varies from 4 to 9, and the thresholds are from 1 to 3 neighbors, so that's varied. And here's an example of how it works, just like a lattice. And it is a lattice, it's just an irregular lattice. So here's one node surrounded by 7 neighbors, which I painted in green. And then a little bit more, so we pick a node and we activate that node and its neighbors, so we get a seed cluster. So there's our seed cluster in bright red. And then around that, they infect some other nodes that are also red. They've switched to red, and they're indicated as a cross-hatching to show they're not seeds. And then these are the ones that are yet to be switched, the grays. So that's the key that you need. And we're going to run this first with no bridge ties. It's just a pure lattice. Your only neighbors are the neighbors that are spatially adjacent. And then we're going to change it, and we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to introduce random ties so that so this node might have a tie to this node, some randomly chosen node on the network. So my phone tells me my time's up. So about 10 more minutes.
I'm so mesmerized I wasn't doing that. Sorry.
I got that.
Sorry.
So you saw how it spread. It had no problem, and it'll do that every time. But it spread, it had one sort of skin surface that just expanded out, right? It didn't jump around, it just worked out spatially. So in a sense, it took the long way around. It didn't take advantage, there were no bridge ties to take advantage of, but it spread, and it spread very successfully. So now, let's run it again, only this time, we're going to perturb the lattice, right? We're going to pick one of it out of every 6 edges, and we're going to replace it with a random tie. We'll use the Maslov-Snelling technique, which holds the degree constant, degree distribution constant by taking 2 at a time and just crossing. So we're going to randomize some ties. We're going to run it again, and it failed. Failed again. You see the random? See how it lit up? Fails again.
Wait, it doesn't spread from the random.
It does a little bit.
Now you see this one spread. This time it didn't. So sometimes it will spread, but not guaranteed, with much lower probability now. And we're going to run it again, and you can see how the random ties, these 4 open up. That was when it hit critical mass. When those 4 lit up, that was the critical mass point. And from there, it just goes. And so now, if we look at this over many trials, yes, Karina.
I really had a question. So let's say that we did get to the critical mass.
Mm-hmm.
If that was true, I mean, and I think it's true, but the question is what's the threshold on the other side, right? Because that means that social movement that reached, I'm thinking like Israel, it reached 500,000.
Mm-hmm.
If that's not a critical mass, then I don't know what's critical mass. That's like almost half of the population we're getting there.
Oh yeah, but see, okay, I'm glad you asked that, because that's what this slide is.
How come it didn't stop? I mean, how come it stopped and didn't continue to stop?
Why did it?
What's the threshold above? There has to be a threshold.
Right. So this is necessary but not sufficient. So there are a lot of other things that can still kill the thing. So for example, if something is, let's say, well, in the case, not the case of Israel, but let's say it's a fad. Fads have a sort of built-in tendency to die because once too many people do it, it's not cool. And so there can be lots of other, there can be police repression, or there can be the response of the state, or it can be a split. Here's my experience from my wayward youth. And my wayward youth, we would just split over the tiniest point of doctrine, right? And the organizations would divide, and that would kill.
And I would guess that time has.
So lots of things can go wrong.
Time in social movement is also a special factor, right? People are tired of getting to protest and demonstration at a certain time. It just.
Right, and so the thresholds could be going up because of police repression. So there's all kinds of things that in the real world. So I don't like to call the web versus the real world, because I think you don't go through. I mean, this is really responding to Richard's wonderful talk. It's not like when you open a browser, you go through a metaphysical moment. It's still the real world. But this is not the real world. This really isn't. This is the virtual world. So this is a very simplified sort of toy world. But it's teaching us something. And we can then, actually in 5 minutes, we're going to test this empirically. So as we tried to do with the BT voicemail. So we can still try to test this stuff. But this is just hypothesis generating. This is not hypothesis testing, except for testing the internal logical validity. But the point here that really responds to what you're saying. The critical mass point occurs really early. Really early. And simple contagions, information and disease, do not have this property. So you cannot use this technique to predict information and disease. But if you suspect that it's a phenomenon with high threshold, you can have predictive abilities based on this logic. Because, these are failed cascades, and it's interesting, they can fail in two ways. This one failed because the growth rate was too high. This one failed because the growth rate was too low. And this one succeeded. So when the growth rate is too high, what happens is that it's just saturating. When the growth rate is too low, it just peters out. This one goes, and even by the time it's here, you probably could make a pretty good guess that it's going to go. But as soon as the slope changes sign, so all of them, even the ones that succeed, the growth rate declines, right? Because of the ratio of the skin surface to the area, you're saturating locally. So the growth rate is going to decline until you open up some fresh territory with those bridge ties. Then it's going to start. And this tells you that happened. The growth rate's going up because now we know that we've reached a large enough group, critical mass, that there's a high enough probability that a random tie will be to an activated node that those things now work. Those random ties now work. And that's what happens here. So as soon as you don't have to know anything about, you don't have to have any network data. You just have to have adoption rates. And you have to track the growth rate, so you just have to know how to calculate the derivative. And as soon as the thing changes sign, place your bets. So it's kind of cool that it lets you do that. Well, I wouldn't bet any of my money on it, but I'd be happy to bet yours. And the reason I wouldn't bet my money is that this is all theory, and the real world is so complicated. As Karine reminds us, good chances you will be wrong, but probably do better than random chance, which is not good enough for me when betting. But so we have this possibility for early prediction that you can't get with simple contagions. And I just want to emphasize that a lot of empirical work needs to be done on this. Some of which, by the way, turns out is going on at USC in computer science. They're actually testing this using data from social media. So we sort of testing it with some data from Arab Spring, and I have to admit that this is not really a rigorous test of this model, but it's sort of a test, and it was close enough that I thought I would present some of this. I want to preface it by saying that I believe that popular uprisings like Arab Spring have always been networked from the Paris Commune to 1989, that the paradigmatic technology for dyads, which is what networks are typically made of, is this little guy, not the smartphone, but the landline, the telephone, that's very dyadic. Those have been around for a while. Face-to-face networks have been around. And what I think has happened, the revolution is in our ability to track networked action that we could never observe before. Impossible to observe networks on the ground as they're operating. But I want to really urge people to be very careful here, not to conclude that social movements are now suddenly networked because we could never see it before. We couldn't see it before, but it was there. Trust me on this. It was there. We just couldn't see it. So anyway, just wanted to get that off my chest. So here's another one I want to get off my chest. The revolution will not be tweeted. So Malcolm Gladwell, bless his heart, he made this prediction like in October of 2010. He must have been so embarrassed.
Never predict.
And 2 months later, of course, the revolution was tweeted. He was literally wrong. But actually, I think he was right.
Yeah.
If we deconstruct this sentence by going back to the original that it's based on. So the original is "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised," which is a poem by Gil Scott Heron from 1971. It goes something like this.
You will not be able to plug in, turn on, and drop out. You will not be able to lose yourself on Skag and skip out from here during commercials because the revolution will not be televised. NBC will not be able to predict the winner at 8:32 on before from 29 districts. The revolution will not be televised. The revolution will not go around with jokes. The revolution will not fight curves and take calls bad breath. The revolution will put you in the driver's seat. The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers. The revolution will be live.
So I think that really was Gladwell's point, that the revolution was live. Yes, it was carried on Twitter, carried on Facebook, carried lots of other ways, but it would have happened anyway, and here's the evidence. So this is the number of users, the number of tweets by country in the Arab world during the period of the Arab Spring. And these are undercounts because it's an imperfect science trying to track down the country of origin of a tweet. You can only get so far. We used a triangulation method that's pretty good, but it's not perfect. So these are undercounts, but it still gives you the relative story. And Egypt is the exception. So Egypt is the top of the list, and there's a revolution. But other than Egypt, it's clear that the revolutions were live. They were actually not, for the most part, tweeted, for the simple reason that in Yemen there was almost nobody using Twitter. There were very, very few Twitter users. And interestingly enough, there's a negative correlation. The countries that had revolutions are at the bottom of this list, and the countries with lots of Twitter are at the top, and did not have revolutions for the most part. So, except for Egypt. Egypt is this very interesting exception. So let's look at Egypt a little more closely. So here's our thresholds. Here's our social contagion, or we sometimes call it complex contagion. So this is looking at the probability of adopting a hashtag, and we picked the 4 of the most popular hashtags during this period of time. These are for the Japanese earthquake and tsunami. These are for the protests. And we calculated the probability of adoption given the number of people that you follow who have already adopted the hashtag. And what we find is, in fact, that the probability goes way up from having 1 to 2 and continues to go up. And it's true for both protest and non-protest hashtags. They both have this property. But protest hashtags even more strongly. And this is also a result that Romero and Kleinberg and a few other co-authors also found outside the Arab Spring context. So there seems to be some evidence here that protest, which is a little bit harder maybe to get involved in, you're not so sure you want to do it, especially in a public forum like Twitter, may take a little more reinforcement than your average hashtag to get people to do it.
That probability of adoption is really quite small, though. It's
Yes.
0.02, 0.04, 0.06.
Right. And any given person is small, but it does respond. It does go up by quite a bit, actually, quite steeply. So this is looking at what happened right before January 25th, the hours leading up. And this is some evidence here that the revolution was tweeted in the sense that Twitter was being activated not as an echo of what happened, but as an anticipation for about 6 to 12 hours before they hit the streets. They are tweeting up with a protest tweet. This is not just Jan 25. Any protest tweet, we would grab it. We took all the protest hashtags, and a message that has any one of those hashtags we classified as a protest message. So those things went up. And in fact, it had been going up for a while. This is pretty much the baseline, actually. You don't need to go further to the left. And so it had been creeping up, and then it shoots up right before. So there's some evidence here for Egypt, for sure. This is, I think, a really important slide. This is tracking, again, these 4 very prevalent hashtags, 2 protests, 2 non-protests. And we're measuring the page rank of the user of the tag. And very interesting thing happens. So we'll start with the non-protest. With the non-protest tag, as the frequency goes up, so too does the page rank of the users, or at least it's flat. Pardon? Yes, this is the average. This is the average, not the median. It's the average page rank of the users. It's either sort of constant, bouncing around, or actually goes up with the frequency. So what this is saying is that this is a bottom-up story. This is saying that it's the low page rank, the low status people, it's the least in the network that are adopting early. But then as it spreads, it gets to the hubs. So it's spreading out to in. But the opposite here. Here, as the frequency goes up, the page rank goes down. Here's January 25th. Pops way down. So the average page rank after January 25th, well below what it was before. And the same thing happens here, maybe even more dramatically. So the frequency goes up, the page rank plummets. And some more evidence on this. So first, this is the number of users mobilized each day from through December and January. By mobilized, we mean that it's a user who has used a protest hashtag for the first time, has never used it before. So in other words, what we find is they've been using football hashtags, cinema, music, whatever, and all of a sudden they start using protest hashtags. And on that day, we score them and we say, this is your day of mobilization. You got converted today. And then we track all the people who got converted each day. And you can sort of ignore this because it's temporally truncated, but what can we do about that? So, this is sort of artificial. This is sort of... Has anybody ever been criticized by Siri? She says, I'm not sure what you said. Okay.
Funny, neither
This
did
is
I.
a magic moment, isn't it? Okay, so here's the deal. Siri, you need to ignore these.
Can you clarify, is this English, Arabic, or is there some indication whether these are people that are inside Egypt, or this is all Twitter, or where?
Hang on one second. Is this English? So these are all languages we have on our team. I think I went over the slide. There's a whole bunch of people on our team. John Kleinberg. Let me try to do all the names here. John Kleinberg, Xiaomei Wu, Silvani Tosca, Nuna O, Michael Siemens. We had 2 Arab specialists. We had a region specialist. We had network specialists. We had everybody on the team. And so we had people who were fluent in Arabic. So we had all the tweets. Of course, as you know, most of the hashtags are in English. So this is what's sort of cool is that big mobilization here on January 26th. lots of people for the first time. So, now what we're doing here is we're taking each of these days and we're binning all the users who got mobilized on a given day, and we're asking, and so now we're going to find out what their status is. We're going to measure their page rank, we're going to measure their in degree, we're going to measure how many retweets, well, maybe we're not going to measure the number of retweets they generated because this really turns out to be awfully hard to do. But we're going to do a bunch of these. But this one I have for you today, which is how many times that you were mentioned prior to your day of mobilization. So on the day you got mobilized, what was your status as indicated by how many people had mentioned you, which is not a bad indicator of something.
Michael,
And you can see it's going down.
The last point is erroneous because I think, so Mubarak closed, shut down.
That was a little bit later.
Between the 26th and the 27th, so it might be that time
yeah.
collection.
Yeah, but I think it was actually after this point. It was after the 26th. But you do see this general decline that it's going down, which again is showing that it's not bottom up, it's top down. You've got the higher status people early, and each day the average status of the group that gets mobilized is a little lower than the day before. And this is doing the same thing with, so this one is the number of users who mentioned you. This is the number of mentions, so it's still the same story. And so that's the people I've worked with on this project.
And the data behind this project is just the full data set for that period? Or?
Yeah. We crawled all the Arab countries, including Israel, all the North African countries, yeah, I mean, I can talk some about, maybe we should go offline and talk about the method we used to grab it. But I think we got a pretty thorough collection of the, and we didn't get everybody because they don't have on there, Egypt, so you don't really, it's not easy to do. But we got pretty much the whole thing.
Were you examining your hypothesis about the triads, the connection with this data?
Nope.
I wasn't sure. No, okay. That would be interesting to see, right? Whether, and I don't know if you can see it because a lot of the Egyptian were using, anonymous names, anonymous usernames, specifically because it's authoritarian.
Yeah.
But it would be interesting to see on a Spanish or Occupy or Israel or democratic countries how this triad hypothesis really.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it turns out, it is hard to do. It's not. We tried to do it with last.fm data for music downloads. We thought that might be a good test, and we just couldn't get the right data to be able to do it. Yeah.
So it'd be interesting to see if you could figure out what the correlation is between tweeting and actual participation in a street protest.
Right.
And I know there's there's not a direct correlation. There could be a lot of people who are. People in the United States tweeting about it because they're getting excited that there's revolution happening in Egypt.
And we don't have those tweets.
Okay, so you don't have, but there could be.
We only have the Arab world.
So there could be students in the U.S. who are.
But they're not in our data.
Okay.
How do you know they're not in your data?
Okay, so here's how we did it. We started with users that we knew were in country. Took all of those users.
Based on the location.
Archiving sources and whatnot. Yeah, we just knew. We knew where they were. We knew who their names were. And then we stepped out one step from them. It's not point doing two. So we went out one step from them, and then we went through all those people. We took GPS, which gets you about 2% for the people who turn it on their mobile phone. Then we did profiles, which gets you a few more. And then we did time zones. So there's a Cairo time zone. It's not like the U.S. If this were like the rest of the world, we would have a Los Angeles time zone. So so you could use time zones to figure out countries. So we used that, and then held our breath.
And you get a lot of the solidarity activists who are all modifying their location and time zone to be in solidarity with local.
Yeah, you have the people who are flying to Egypt, to get their GPS locations.
Well, or who just modify it locally.
Pardon?
Who just modify it locally.
Yeah, my time zone is still in Tehran.
Yeah.
2009.
That's right. So there's some noise in the data. One of the nice things, though, about having 100,000 data points is that it does a real number on noise. No, he does not do a number on that. Yes.
So in
bigger
addition
point-
to, oh, go ahead.
The bigger point I want to make, though, is that we know from a lot of other research that there's still like this sort of decoupling between what people know and what they do. So, for example, if you look specifically at like boycott research, we know that most people who say they support a boycott, they're ideologically supportive of it, they know about it, you know, they say they're going to do it, don't actually boycott. If it's easier, so you say you're going to boycott Domino's Pizza, that there's a Domino's Pizza on the way home from work. You stop by, you know, it's just easy to stop and get Domino's Pizza. And so usually a better predictor of going to a protest is something like your friends happen to be going and they take you with you. Even that's even a better predictor than whether you are ideologically supportive of it. So people who get involved, for example, in the pro-choice or pro-life movement, start off like they don't care about abortion. They're going for something to do on a Saturday night, and their friends take them with them. They become supportive after they protest rather than before.
So we don't know who's actually in the street, but my guess is from the number of people in Tahrir Square, most of them
A lot of people-
are.
yeah, a lot of people are
But actually, you know, you're raising a great question. It is, I mean, in some ways, it's Richard's question from the last talk too. I mean, so how do we know how do we know this is really telling us anything about the offline world? And I think it's not telling us everything, but it's telling us more than we ever could have known before in an earlier era of social science. Also, I would just add that we have to always keep in mind this question that you're raising and ruthlessly interrogate our measures. So, for example, we started out, as you saw, looking at hashtags. And then, you know, one day I realized, you know, what we're doing there is we're studying the spread of hashtags. We're not studying the spread of protest involvement. And what we want to do is protest involvement. So that's when we switched. We stopped looking at the spread of hashtags, and we started looking at the spread of mobilization, which we've operationalized as you suddenly go from tweeting about non-protesting, you start tweeting about protest. And we can filter that further to see how long did you keep doing it, you know, did you drop off at some point. So we actually have a whole list of things to now ask about to see if we can fine-tune that even further to get to the people who are really seriously mobilized.
Or who described being at the protest or something along those lines.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So
I
you
mean,
can hide-
God forbid we should ever actually have to read the tweets. So my hat's off to Gilad and Dana for actually reading it. And I was sitting there thinking, come on, guys, just do PageRank and, you know, centrality measures and call it a day. Go have some fun. Life is short.
Okay, so you can tell us that you don't only have to get my attention by raising my hand. You could do what Mario did and send me a Facebook message saying he wants to ask a question.
Mario, could you do me a favor and send me by Facebook your question? I'm going to go on.
He's just gonna echo your phone.
Given my English pronunciation would probably be easier to understand it. No, anyway, going back to the issue of diffusion that you were addressing earlier, you mentioned your paper with Damon in the AJS, in the same issue that happened to be a paper by myself and Delia Baldassari. That was just back to back, and I would like to try to reconcile the two things, even though they are very different. And in that paper, in our paper, we look at interorganizational ties, and we look at different types of strengths. And what we found on one level was a kind of small world structure in which clusters of organizations were connected by ties which implied only exchange of resources. And within the clusters, there were ties which are double level, exchange of resources and joint shared memberships. But the other thing was that what we found was that the tendency to balance trials was much stronger among the strong ties. So the logic, the question is, we go to the point. What we suggested was against the theory of social capital. Involvement of people in multiple memberships doesn't necessarily generate huge bridges because it facilitates closure within. Now, the connection to your argument is the whole your argument about diffusion is, if I get it correctly, is about it doesn't account for difference in strengths of ties.
We did not. We actually said all the ties.
No, it would be, I think it would be interesting.
We wanted to net that out. But
I
it
would like
actually,
to resonate.
that's
I would like to
conservative.
resonate. One possibility would be that in terms of interorganizational tie, there was already reached a kind of critical mass, and therefore past that, the tendency was to closure and segment and fragmentation. Or otherwise, other possibility, looking at the tie strength complicates the model.
Yeah.
Right.
That's why we didn't.
That's what I told you.
That's why we didn't put it in, because it complicates the model. And in our case, it's a conservative assumption. So the effect that we're reporting will be actually a lot stronger if we make the assumption that these bridge ties are actually less effective, because now they're actually not even going to get you the signal. We assume that you still pay attention, you're still influenced. But if we were to say that it takes 2 bridge ties to get you the same influence from infected neighbors as one strong tie, now it's going to be even more dramatic in effect. So, but we sort of want to keep it simple, and so we didn't take advantage of that piece.
I'm interested in your baseline, and I think about the typical critique of diffusion research that's very pro, innovation bias. It only tracks, a lot of the early research only tracked the successful examples. And so in this
You can't
case,
hear the dogs that don't bark.
right, exactly. But that baseline, and the notion of searching for like pound protest or something like that makes me wonder what's going on in other countries where there's certainly political frustration. But it also, to me, weds the field researcher with the Twitter researcher, because I don't buy it that it began on Twitter. It's in the living rooms, it's at the coffee shops, and we know this from the journalists who've been there. And so I'm curious about that baseline and how we might see variation across different political contexts, so that we can maybe start modeling what the failed protests look like, the ones that don't take off.
Right. I mean, in some ways, that logic is why we wanted to include Japan, tsunami, because we want to see the off diagonal.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, I think you're absolutely right that you can't really conclude anything by only looking at the positive case. You have to look to see does the other case differ.
Right.
And the nice thing, of course, is that we now have the ability to do that for the first time. So we don't have the excuse we had anymore, which is before we just couldn't observe it. Now we can, so you have to do it. Yes, Sasha. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so putting aside for a moment the deep questions around sort of agency and what it is that moves people to participate in context and what it is that moves people to actually spread media. And I really like Jenkins' framing of spreadability as opposed to virality, because it relocates the agency within people who are actually actors within social media spaces rather than just imagining the disease metaphor. But that's something that we wouldn't reach agreement on. I'm much more interested in understanding how you think cross-media platforms, given the idea that what you're looking at is the way that we require multiple touch points to somebody, and that we also know from other work, and some of the work we're doing at the Center for Civic Media is really trying to look at this, how the messages spread across a very diverse media ecology. And so some of that first slide that I showed yesterday, trying to look at front page newspaper coverage and how that tracks to social media. To me, that's a much more complicated, interesting, and ground truth approach to thinking about how information flows in social movement contexts in a networked and diversified media ecology. So I'd love to see you think more about how that works. And in our spring case, we're talking about Al Jazeera and other satellite networks picking up social media.
Facebook for the size.
Well, no, I mean the satellite penetration rate in Tunisia is above 90%, and the Twitter and Facebook penetration rate is around 20%. So what we're talking about is people.
No, Sasha, this is a typical wrong argument that everybody uses. In Cairo and Alexandria, 18 to 35 is 65% population on internet, users internet.
Well, we could go deeper into those data, but what we do know is that the majority of people their first mediated interaction is through television. It's not through when you look at the number. So when you're going to reach that tipping point, you have to hit broadcast media. Is what I'm trying to say. That moment when the curve switches, right?
So we actually this is based on a paper that's coming out in Social Networks with Vlad Barash and Chris Cameron. Both were former grad students in my lab. And and in that paper, we do both the small world story and we do the Power Law Network story. We do both of those. And the Power Law Network story is sort of the hubs, right? The broadcasters that are going to hit huge numbers of people. And there's a small number, but they have a huge audience. So they're captured in it. And the results are identical. The extreme heavy-tailedness of the degree distribution does the same thing as the random times do. But it's harder to explain, and so I left it out of the talk, but it is in the paper.
Okay, Phil, and then Dana.
I just want to respond to this.
Okay.
There's a symbiotic relationship going on here, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I think that's one of the reasons you can see a huge difference with what happened in Egypt versus what's happening in Syria. Yes, these things happened long before the conversations in the communities, what was happening. What happened, though, with the social media is the social media in many ways tracked it up to the mainstream media, and they fed on one another and felt it back down.
Right.
And I think that it's really difficult to actually study these things without realizing the symbiotic relationship between all of these different actors.
Exactly.
And I think it's great that we can get these moments where we have data where we can see some component of it, but if we're talking about social movements as a whole, we have to realize that they're all interplayed, and it's not that that mainstream media is better than social media or vice versa. It's that they're actually all interwoven at this point.
And actually,
But I think Saj's point is right, that when the hubs get activated, when the hubs get activated, that is a really important signal, because it means that you're now going to have all these people.
And even when they get activated wrong, which I think is actually the important part of what happened in Egypt, the fact that the news constantly covered it as a Facebook revolution, which gave them a chance, an excuse really, to cover what was happening in Egypt every day for months, was phenomenal. The problem is by the time we hit Syria, they no longer had a new news story to cover. So Syria, they were not covering it in the same way. So even though the news story in Egypt was wrong, it allowed it to stay into the media for so long. And I think this is a challenge for social movements, is how do you actually keep the symbiotic relationship of wanting to spread the story, even if the story is all wrong. So this is why I think Malcolm Gladwell, by actually pissing off people, made it a story that people covered, and then they looked into what was happening. And that fed it. So I think that's also where it's difficult. We often talk about what is important and useful information to flow, rather than the flows of the attention. And the attention, in some ways, are what social movements ride on.
Well, if I can just sort of bring this to a little technical point here. The technical point is that when you're graphing the diffusion, for critical mass purposes, and I think this responds to what you said, that what's important is not the number of activated nodes, but the number of nodes exposed to the activated nodes. And so when you hit the hub, that's going to go up.
Okay, Phil. Now.
So,
Finally.
thank you. I actually wanted to go back to the first part, your theory of critical mass and your toy model, and you made a clear distinction between, based on the threshold of activation, between, on one hand, epidemics of disease and information, arguing that there is this point of redundancy, and a higher threshold 2 or above for activation. And
for changing behavior.
And you partly addressed that operationally by saying that you were trying to look at further than just spreading hashtags. But I have 2 questions. One is that I'm not sure that even epidemics and information can be put in the same category. For example, in epidemics, typically a virus doesn't compete with others, whereas in information, we've shown that the competition for limited attention can be crucial. In fact, it can by itself drive dynamics where some memes go viral and others don't, and so you don't need a more sophisticated explanation to even see these huge huge cascades, and so that's one point where clearly there is a difference between information and disease. Yeah. And the other one is, and maybe you can say more about that. It's not clear to me how you distinguish between information and activation.
Because you have to believe the information.
Even if, exactly. Yeah. Even if you see a hashtag, you may decide that you only follow it or pay attention to it when you've seen it from enough of your friends. And so I could imagine these threshold mechanisms apply very much in the information realm, because that, whether you start paying attention to a particular topic or meme or hashtag or whatever, or whether you decide to click on a link and read the news report, that may affect who else you listen to and what other information you're exposed to.
So we're
and
using this
whether
very
you get
narrow-
activated. So to me, it's very much of a gray area between the information and the activation.
Oh, yeah.
So I was
No,
wondering if you can say.
Yeah, we were absolutely, we talked about that a lot when we were talking about what term to use, and we thought about using terms like knowledge instead of information, even maybe bits instead of information. But because the point we wanted to make is that what you do with the information, whether you believe it, whether you act on it, that's the social side, or we call it complex contagions. But if it's just, who won the hockey game last night? Do you know that or do you not know it? Once you know it, you know it. You don't have to. And so, in that sense, we were saying that there are what we wanted to say is that it's not that Watson, Strogatz, and Granovetter are talking about something that doesn't exist. Yes, they're talking about something that there are cases of simple contagions. They're out there in the world, and some kinds of information, or at least the information that involves knowing as opposed to doing or believing, that's simple. And I think that there's plenty of stuff for that to be relevant to. It's just the whatever is to be diffused. That's the part we take issue with.
Sorry, it's just a small postscript. Even the knowing is not so black and white because there's a lot of misleading information. Right. There's a lot, lots of us have looked at that, and do you even believe that this meeting is happening, or is this information about this party?
Yeah, I mean, we were thinking of. You have to remember the people we deal with are these little silicon-based life forms, and you can tell when the bit is in their head, and that's So we're not dealing with the human types which is what you're referring to. So in our world, we can make this a very nice, clean distinction, and that's why we like to live in that world.
Okay, so was there yes?
Yeah, I really like this idea of redundancy because it fits well with, creating the beginning of the theory of social movements need to be retweeted, not just tweeted, right? Because, we see in the mobilization of Occupy that when you look at it exclusively on Twitter, it looks huge. It looks impressive. It looks well organized. And it's because people work with a kind of bureaucratic cultural logic already. So you have these development of these tweet boats where people they know they have to consistently be tweeting information and the right information, so verified and legitimate information. So they need almost verified and legitimate Twitter handles in order to get people to come out into the street. But then there's a problem, because the difference between the people who are tweeting the revolution and the people who are on the ground is that when we're on the ground, we generally run out of batteries. And so there are these weird effects that happen when you're on the ground and you're relying on frontline SMS kind of technologies where you're grouping together and you're getting these massive text text messages where you're in a march and you're trying to figure out where to go, and 30 people up ahead of you've been detained by the cops, so you want to move to 6th and Main, but at the same time, so you're kind of snaking through the city, but at the same time you're trying to follow these Twitter hashtags, and if the Twitter hashtag trends, it becomes absolutely useless for mobilization. And so when you're in the street, you have to sort of switch between these multi-modes of getting your information, so long as you have batteries. And then there are people at home that are watching the live streams that appear to be in the streets because they're tweeting about where people are and what's happening, but they're just eating pizza. And so it's hard for me to quite grasp what's happening here, but I do think there's something to this redundancy and this retweet effect that we should look into, even though it's hard to map.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the real storyline here is not so much the redundancy because lots of people have looked at thresholds before us, going all the way back to Thomas Schelling but in a way, the story here is not so much even the redundancy as much as it is the clustering. So instead of this idea that the clusters make things go slow, but it's these bridges that allow it to go fast. This makes the small world. Yeah, that's true for information, some kinds of information and disease, but may not be true for social movements. I mean, I think that's more the thing than, it's not just that there are these thresholds, it's a bunch of implications that follow from that we're interested in.
Just a short comment, going back to the not knowing and doing discrepancy or the difference. If you introduce some recovery rate with immunization, then it can be explained not fully, but partially, I think it will be partially explained. Like knowing is just, okay, I exposed some message, then susceptible to infected, but doing is something different. Even if I saw the message or I exposed to certain information, I may not do the action. So it's immunized or recovered. So the recent recent disease diffusion model include always the recovery rate or recovery chance. So.
And we found the equivalent, which is that some people who hear the message and don't act are probably immune. And also, just to follow up on the previous question too, because there's something else I should have added to that. But one of the implications of this is that early on in the process, you should spread your leaflets in dormitories and in residential neighborhoods, not in workplaces. Look for networks that look like lattices, that have lots of local structure. That's where you want to go.
Well, I had a comment that it's not directly related to, but it was raised actually by this issue of the battery question, etc. One of the things that I heard a student presented a paper at the NSF web shop that was held in Maryland, was that there were several instances where people, especially in Egypt, were using Twitter and Facebook to mislead the government about where those events were being held.
That's another.
And I don't know how you think of credibility in those cases, etc. But because they knew that the government was watching it, so they essentially made the government believe that they were going to do something here, when in fact they ended up mobilizing to do something else.
The telephony system just crashed. It was such an overwhelming people coming to Tel Aviv that it just crashed, and we were talking about it.
And I'm sure that within not so many years, there are going to be activists out there who are deliberately trying to confuse people like us that are trying to study it. Let's really throw Naj off on this.
Sorry, just a small bit on that. I mean, we've had several instances recently in which, I'm thinking of Russia especially, but protests were drowned by sending fake messages using those hashtags that the organizers were trying to use. So that turned out to be a very effective way to completely neutralize the social media. Very simple, just create a bunch of bots that send random messages, and then people won't be able to see the actual messages. It's been very effective.
Yeah, and actually, some ways, spam and bots on Twitter is going to make it hard for people like us to use the data.
And there's also one of the primary solidarity activities of remote activism is people modify their icons, their location, and a bunch of other profile information to indicate that they're in the remote location. So I'm curious if we have any actual information about, like, in Iran election, like what proportion of the Twitter users that appeared to be in Iran actually were in Iran, versus what proportion were solidarity.
Back then, the network was so different, but the majority of users using that hashtag were not in Iran.
Right.
But there was a number of people who.
So I'm saying it's not a small amount of noise in the system. It's actually one of the major things that's happening when we look at remote solidarity activity in social network sites. So that's another. It's not something that's easy to kind of factor out. It's a major part of what happens.
Richard has an answer to that. No, I mean, I have that data. So I have a 650,000 tweet collection of the Iran election hashtag, and you see the date. Well, you see in sort of if you sort of create a chronicle of accounts on the ground according to some sort of retweet measure, you see the exact day when people are asked to change their location, and then you see quite a massive change, and so you can get a percentage.
But in some ways, the problem is not just the users, and they obviously they put in a lot of false information, especially in their profiles. But it's also Twitter's a problem. I mean, they've stopped giving out whitelists. They've announced to the academic world, thank you very much for doing all these studies with Twitter, but we're done with that now. We don't need to do that. We're going to take it over. Thank you very much. We're going to do the research internally now. I think we have to be concerned about industry closing their doors to us. I mean, especially Twitter, where their business model is not advertising, selling data. So they're going to want to protect that. And so the Center for Advanced Studies at Stanford, I'm working with Stephen Koslin, the director of the center, and we're trying to start an initiative to get industry and academia to come together and build some type of collaboratory to facilitate, to set some ground rules that will protect industry. So the first thing you have to do is you have to make it worthwhile to industry. But I think those initiatives are going to be really essential because, in some ways, that's a bigger problem for me than the users giving us a hard time.
Okay,
I just wanted to mention it very quickly that it sounds like what we're describing is just that some of this data has more demanding cleaning requirements than it seems at first. And I think from creating the actor types in the paper you presented yesterday to identifying timestamps or anticipating collections that you might want such that you can identify those changes is increasingly important across all of these studies.
I mean, the BT data took forever to clean. That was huge.
Okay, I think we should probably close this session out.